Okay. Hey guys. So this is the second episode that I'm putting up with the creating your own trading app using OpenAI's Codex. And from the last one, I give a brief overview and kind of a look at the way it was before I started making some changes to the user interface. And this is after about 4 hours of agent work of me going back and forth and feeding it the instructions for a series of steps to make changes. A lot of these changes were integration because let me switch over to the app. Let's see, let's bring it up. Okay, here's the app. So everything that you see here is what we built as I was going on. It's like, first I want to get the data. Now that I've got the data, I want to see the data. And then once I can see the data and it looks good, then I want to build out candles. So the base data that we're collecting was the 1 minute candle information. And all my trading stuff that I do it on 2, 5, 15, 30 minute. And so I just want to take the 1 minutes and then build the 2s, the 5s, the 15s, the 30s, whatever I want. But the core data that I'm building off of is just the 1 minute, so I'm only retrieving one set of data. And so that was the next step, is just build these. Now I want to see them, just see the data. And so what we did, so everything on this left hand side is just a result of taking the data, coming up with something, and then looking at it. And I just want to be able to see it, through the app, because you don't know what you're working with unless you can see it. So it was one at a time built, and it's just this, the request for make this, make that. And so once I hit a stage where I actually got some information and said, okay, this is useful, I'm going to continue the project further. Then I went through a series of steps to say, it's like it started integrating everything. I want to automate some of the data collection. I want to automate gap fills and stuff, and that's introduced other problems that we'll discuss as we keep working on the program, and I'll share that information with you. So the 4 hours of work was basically taking the left panel, the center panel, and the right panel, and integrating everything together to make it more aware of itself, to where it's becoming an integrated user interface for you as to work with. And one of my impressions is that this admin thing, it was just something I bolted on top because I wanted to make changes right then and there. And then it's like, okay, I need to be able to start and stop the application. I want to update the ranges of the data that I'm looking at and be able to look at different ranges. And so it just kind of grew out of that. And this thing got really long, and so then I had to make it more context aware. But apparently after all these changes, I lost my context awareness. But so you can see every admin action I can take, it's exposed. It's not dependent on the left hand panel on where we are displaying. So it's become a little clunky, but I was already leaning that I'm going to get rid of this admin panel and taking these actions and more integrating it into the center panel as specifically, as I start fleshing it out. Okay, so some of the quick changes are, I now have this main information panel here, and it kind of gives you what we're looking at, because at the beginning I wanted to set for a specific symbol, and then everything over here on the left hand side, when I'm clicking on it, it would only show me relationships on that specific symbol. So when I go into candles, I'm only seeing the candles for this symbol. And I go into indicators, it only shows me the indicators for this symbol, not all the indicators that are out in the database, because then you're just looking at a bunch of mush. And so what we did on behind the scenes is that it created a new thing up here to where you always know where you are. This is another reason why I'm leaning towards getting rid of my admin panel, because we're starting to pull stuff over into the center panel to work with. And so if you notice, if I click here, it changes where I am up here, and information here changes as well. So here's the main, it changes. Candles, it changes. So this is all the work that was done behind the scenes. And then some additional work is like on my symbol status, I can get the latest, what's my data range coverage that I have. I know if you'll see this 7.1, I wanted to go back, 6 to 9 months, but the API only limited to 30 days of what you can pull back on the 1 minute. And so because it's as far back as I can pull back on the 1 minute, then building up from all of that, that's as far back as I could go. And so I wanted to keep it go forward, so we're going to keep the data and keep going forward. This gives me the latest refresh, so I know up to how far all the data is. And I have jobs running in the background constantly that's going out polling and coming back. We're going to, that's some other refinement areas that we'll go through. Some other small changes is that it put in, I can sort now based on type, active, I can sort it in alphabetical order. There's all my features. All of these, we'll probably set these up to suppress for displaying because I don't want these. These are all just test related, to run test for when it's doing the smoke test to make sure everything works. And it's just when you're building an application, you want to make sure that nothing breaks, and one way to make sure nothing breaks is that you have test data out there. It's not really for the user to see, it's more for the application to test against to make sure everything is working like it should work. So this is just, all we did was like add little things, add little features to make things work and become more seamless. Okay, so I thought I would share with where we are, what we've been doing, and how this all kind of ties together. So one of the things I did after I hit a point where I said, okay, this is what we're going to go, I want to go forward, but I need to start syncing up my LLM agent with the Codex agent, make sure I'm at a baseline starting point. And so I had the LLM agent. And this is a great thing about agents, stuff that would take days to work, and you never ever have a complete picture of a project. You get to a point where you have a good idea about pieces of the project and what's actively being worked on, but then you start losing visibility of overall of how the whole application stands. There's documentation out there, but it's hard to gather. And what's great about the agents is that they can go through all of the documentation a lot faster than you could and summarize it and pull it together and present it in a way that's easily readable. So I had the LLM give me the commands to tell the Codex agent to go through all the code and review it, compile it, and summarize all the features and what we have and everything, and then give that back to the LLM agent to where it could then look at it and start looking at it and breaking it down on how we want to start working things. Because what it started off is like work on this, work on this, work on this. You have things that have been building out, and now you need to start coalescing it all together and say this is a group of things that need to stay together, and this is how we address issues that involve that. And so what we have here is that I went through, one of the things is for automation, I want to make sure I have no gaps. And if I have gaps, we're going to fill it in. So I'd already done this step before starting this series. And reporting and research, signal and events. So reporting and research, so we want to have reports, and I want to be able to do research. So we haven't gotten to the point of implementing any research because we're building the framework. We're at the very beginnings here. And then I know that there are signals and events, and then we want to make sure that everything that we've done here works and how reliable. So operations just starting up the server that you have and shutting it down and making sure everything's running. And if you run into issues where something gets locked up or it crashes or for whatever reason, that you want to be able to recover and not lose data. I came from a world of accounting and finance, and the worst thing that could ever happen is that you run into a situation where something crashes and data's lost. Because data lost means stuff going out of balance, and if you lose data in a business world, you're losing money and you're losing orders. And when you start losing money and losing orders, you start losing customers, and customers start thinking that you're unreliable. So I want to make the desktop function in that correct way, because the worst thing you can do is lose data. And so we're trying to make it to where that data loss is as small as possible and you can recover from it easily. Okay, so this is the step that I just did, and it took about 4 hours with the agent to go through it, and then it was a quick review and do some minor cleanups and tweaks. But while I was doing all this, I was thinking about my next step, and this is really a big step that I'm going to start on next. This is getting the streaming data in. And so the more I thought about the streaming data is that it probably should be its own standalone, separate from the application, because even if the application goes up and down, I want the streaming data, because I'm collecting it and storing it. So all that tick data coming in, I haven't decided on how detail of the tick that I want to store. And this is something that we'll be working on probably over the next few weeks. It depends on how fast this all goes. It keeps going faster than I thought it would, so that's why I keep continuing working on it. That's why I decided to share what I'm working on. So this the tick stream. So my end vision is that I will end up with a trading chart, just like you see on TradingView, Thinkorswim, any of the other trading applications that are out there that you're executing on. I want to be able to see my bar chart filling in real time and adjusting, and I'll have to the second, updates on potential entry points that you want to execute on. And then once these start flashing that enter here, I will enter on my trading platform. It's all manual right now, but I may eventually integrate with the other trading platforms and accounts to where it will actually execute trades. But first I want to make sure it works, and so that's like way down the road right now. So because keeping that in mind, I did discussions back and forth with the LLM just to kind of go get a clear picture of what I want. Is this the right approach? Am I going the right direction to pull it out? And in the end, we're going to pull it out. I'm going to keep all the data in the same database schema. It's one of the tricky things when I look. I'm running a local Docker MySQL. It's good for storing data and reading data off of. It's not a transactional processing system, but that's not what I'm building. So MySQL is perfectly fine for this. And looking at the way I want it, we'll still keep everything in the same schema. This is a small application, so a single schema is working. I'm not building out a giant enterprise type application or even making it to where it's like multiple people using it, and so you have to start breaking things down into multiple schemas. So we're going to keep it all in the same schema on the database. It's just that when I do development work, we're setting ownership between who owns what. They'll be able to read each other's tables, but if the real time is writing information to this table, I only want the real time process to be writing, because It's MySQL. And I want to keep ownership clear on which processes own which tables. They can all read, but if it's making updates, then I want the updates to be made by either the application itself or this new one that will be pulling out the real-time streaming. And real-time streaming is basically I want to record all the ticks, and I don't know at what level of ticks or I want to record, because streaming data, it may become variable. And at this point, I don't know. And so we'll discuss it in later times. Okay, so just so this is what came out of the recommendation. So these are the steps, and so I'm on the last step that we'll be executing because I wanted to get all these major pieces just stood up. And once they're stood up and I'm working with things, then you can start making further decisions. But this is all as is, kind of to say. Okay, let's go to some of the work that I just completed. So this is kind of how. So this the UI that we just completed is basically 15 steps. I like having the LLM break it out into smaller chunks of code instead of getting this long, giant thing of these are all the changes. There's 100 changes I want you to make. What I found is that sometimes the agents can get lost, and so it's easier to make them smaller. And since the LLM and the agent I keep keeping them synced. So after this next step, I will go through and do a big sync up, and then we'll start addressing what the steps are. So let me get back here. So what I like is having the agent break it up. So this broke up all the changes that we're making into smaller steps, and so I can look at what is being done. The agent does a very good job of typing out all the instructions and keeping the focus tight on what you want the agent to be working on. Because sometimes if I give it, just if you're free forming into it, even if you do some work ahead of time, I'm going to always miss steps. But I've instructed the LLM agent to always make sure that all these things are kept in check. And so by keeping all that in check, it remembers a lot more than what you could remember as a person, and you know that you're always giving all the constraints that it should be operating under. And so this is just an example of what it's doing. And on all these steps, I keep the acceptance very light. Unless it's building a test scenario, then it will do the test as well. And then you just step through it, and then you review it. You start and stop the application server, make sure nothing pops up for error messages and stuff, and you navigate and you check. A lot of the stuff here was making changes behind the scenes, so there wasn't much that you could see up front, and so you had to run through several of the steps before you actually get a change that the user would be able to interact with and see. And I'm fine with doing these steps. It's just that I found that breaking it up into smaller chunks and having the agent work on just those smaller chunks, it may cost more tokens, but you have less headaches on when you start if something does break. I've had very few things break so far with this method. Okay, so just kind of sum up. So the next steps is that we're going to start working on the real-time tick feed and storing that information. And then the next step after that will be to analyze the tick feed and determine what granular level of the tick feed that I want to store. Do I get any information for sub-second, second? Can it go 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, or do I need it every 1/10 of a second? I don't know at this point, how much I can get out of it. Does it really matter what happens in the sub-second? I doubt it really matters. You get a lot of jumping around for display, but does it really matter for storing for data to do analysis with? So that's kind of where we're heading, And then those are the things that we got to do some analysis on, and then come up with a final plan of what I want to do for the tick. My first thought that I'll have an open hours tick storage level granularity, and then when the market closes, you keep it at a different level of recording, because we're talking about data that's being stored, and am I getting any additional value by storing at the same level? Because 90% of the transactional volume probably happens during the open market hours versus the off market hours. We're still gathering the data, because the market's open and moving and you can trade it. It's just at what level of data do I need it for the off hours. So we'll kind of cut it off there. So that's what we'll start working on next.